It was an unseasonably damp autumn morning when the case that would come to be known as the mystery of the weeping statue first presented itself. The streets of London glistened with a thin veil of mist, and the sound of distant carriage wheels echoed off the cobblestone streets like whispers from another world. Sherlock Holmes, ever the restless intellect, was seated in his customary chair at 221B Baker Street, the morning newspaper lying unread upon the table. Instead, he was absorbed in a peculiar experiment involving a vial of thick black liquid which he was carefully dripping onto a sheet of parchment. I had long ceased to question his odd habits, though I was not above remarking upon them. "You know, Holmes," I said, folding my own newspaper, "there are times when I wonder if you perform these experiments solely to vex me." Holmes did not look up. Curious observation, Watson, though entirely incorrect. If I sought to vex you, I would have chosen something far more dramatic, perhaps a controlled detonation of chemicals. He smiled faintly. "No, this is rather more mundane." Before I could press him further, our discussion was interrupted by the sudden arrival of Mrs. Hudson, our ever-faithful landlady. Its expression bore the unmistakable signs of someone caught between concern and curiosity. "There's a gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said. "A Lord Percival Bainbridge seems quite anxious." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "A nobleman at this hour? Now that is intriguing. Show him in." Moments later, Lord Bainbridge entered. He was a man of distinguished bearing, his graying hair immaculately combed, though there was something about his demeanor that suggested a deep unease. His gloved hands trembled slightly as he removed his hat. Holmes, ever the observer, took in his appearance with a glance before gesturing to the chair opposite him. "Lord Bainbridge, I presume you have had a troubled night." The nobleman blinked. How did you?" Holmes waved a hand dismissively. "Your overcoat is damp at the hem, suggesting you have been outside for longer than necessary. Yet your gloves are dry, meaning you have only recently come indoors. Your eyes are red from lack of sleep, and the manner in which you clutch your hat suggests nervous agitation rather than mere politeness." Bainbridge exhaled, as if confirming to himself that he had indeed come to the right man. "Mr. Holmes," he said, leaning forward, "I am here because of a most impossible occurrence." Holmes smiled slightly. "You have my attention." Bainbridge licked his lips before speaking. "I am the curator of St. Agnes Cathedral, one of the oldest and most esteemed churches in London, and last night the statue of St. Agnes began to weep." There was a moment of silence. I could not help but exchange a glance with Holmes. He, however, remained entirely composed. "A weeping statue," he repeated. Bainbridge nodded fervently. Not merely condensation, not a trick of the light. The statue shed tears, clear as glass, running down her marble cheeks. He shuddered. "The clergy believe it to be a miracle, but he hesitated, lowering his voice. "I fear it is something else." Holmes leaned forward. "Explain." Bainbridge took a deep breath. "The statue of St. Agnes has stood in the cathedral for over a century, untouched, unaltered. But 3 nights ago, I received an anonymous letter warning me that the saint would soon grieve for the sins of men." Holmes' expression sharpened. "You did not think to report this?" Bainbridge sighed. "It seemed absurd at the time, a meaningless warning, some religious fanatic's ramblings. But then, last night, I saw it with my own eyes. The statue was weeping." He shuddered. "It began after evening mass. At first, the clergy thought it an illusion, but as the hours passed, the tears continued to fall." Holmes steepled his fingers. "And you believe there is foul play involved?" Bainbridge hesitated. "I cannot say. But this morning, I returned to the church before dawn, before anyone else arrived, and what I found chilled me to the bone." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small, folded slip of paper, which he placed upon Holmes' desk. Holmes unfolded it. The note was scrawled in an uneven hand, written in what appeared to be red ink. "The saint weeps, for the past has been uncovered. Let the guilty beware." Holmes tapped the note thoughtfully. Fascinating. This suggests intent, rather than mere superstition. I frowned. But what could it mean? Bainbridge exhaled. "That is why I came to you, Mr. Holmes. I fear that this is more than a religious oddity. That some force wants the world to believe that St. Agnes is weeping for a reason." Holmes stood abruptly, retrieving his coat. "Lestrade will wish to be present for this." Lestrade. Bainbridge blinked. "You mean the police?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "If there is foul play at work, Lord Bainbridge, then we shall require a very human explanation for a so-called miracle." The carriage ride to St. Agnes Cathedral was swift but silent. I could see the weight of anxiety upon Lord Bainbridge's shoulders, though he remained composed. Lestrade, who had joined us reluctantly, crossed his arms as we approached the great stone building. "You've brought me to a church, Holmes." Holmes smirked. "Surely even Scotland Yard must find interest in a statue that weeps warnings." Lestrade sighed, but followed us inside. The cathedral was grand and solemn, its high vaulted ceilings casting long shadows over the flickering candlelight. And there, at the front, stood the statue of St. Agnes, a marble figure, serene and solemn, and upon her cheeks thin, glistening trails of moisture. Lestrade inhaled sharply. "Bloody hell." Holmes said nothing. He strode forward, eyes scanning every detail of the statue, the altar, the surrounding floor. He was searching, and then he stopped, without a word. He knelt at the base of the statue, his fingers brushing against the marble floor. A thin smile crossed his lips. Well, he murmured. "This is rather clever." I frowned. "You've found something?" Holmes straightened. "Perhaps." He turned to Lestrade. "Tell me, Inspector, what do you know of hidden mechanisms?" Lestrade blinked. "Hidden? What?" Holmes only smiled. The mystery had begun. The air inside St. Agnes Cathedral was thick with the scent of aged-stoned candle wax and the faint musk of damp wood. The grand interior, with its towering columns and stained glass windows, seemed to press inward, as though the very walls had witnessed centuries of whispered secrets and hidden sins. Holmes stood motionless before the statue of St. Agnes, his sharp eyes tracing every detail with an intensity that suggested the puzzle was already taking shape in his mind. Lestrade, arms crossed, regarded him with a mixture of impatience and reluctant curiosity. "You said something about hidden mechanisms, Holmes," he muttered. "Are you telling me this weeping statue is a parlor trick?" Holmes exhaled, brushing his fingers along the base of the marble pedestal. "I am telling you that miracles, Lestrade, have a rather inconvenient habit of aligning with human deception." He glanced up at the faint trails of moisture upon the marble cheeks of St. Agnes. "The question is not whether the statue weeps, but rather how, and more importantly, why now?" Lord Percival Bainbridge, who had been standing in uneasy silence, finally spoke. "Mr. Holmes, I beg you to tread carefully. This is a place of worship. Many believe this to be a divine sign." Holmes nodded absent-mindedly. "Faith has its place, Lord Bainbridge, but so does truth." His fingers pressed against the pedestal again, searching. Then, with a sharp movement, he rapped his knuckles against the stone. The hollow sound echoed faintly. Holmes smiled. "Fascinating." Lestrade frowned. "That sounded odd." Holmes turned to Lord Bainbridge. "Is this statue original to the cathedral?" Bainbridge hesitated. "Yes and no. The statue itself is over 100 years old, but it was moved to this position only a decade ago, after renovations to the east wing. Holmes' gaze sharpened. Ah, and was any structural work done beneath it? Bainbridge frowned. I don't recall. Holmes' eyes gleamed. Then I believe it is time we look beneath our saintly guardian. With permission from the clergy, a small team of workers was summoned to assist in shifting the heavy marble base of the statue. Lestrade, ever skeptical, muttered about the absurdity of disturbing sacred ground. But Holmes ignored him entirely, as the base was carefully pried loose. Narrow seam became visible, a trapdoor, expertly concealed within the pedestal's design. Bainbridge inhaled sharply. Good heavens, I had no idea. Holmes knelt beside the hidden entrance, running his fingers over the aged wood. And yet, someone did. He glanced up at Lestrade. Care to do the honors, Inspector? Lestrade sighed, stepping forward. With some effort, he pulled at the latch. The trapdoor groaned open, revealing a dark passageway descending beneath the cathedral. I felt a chill creep up my spine. A secret tunnel beneath the church. Holmes smiled faintly. More than a tunnel, Watson. A forgotten space. Bainbridge's voice trembled slightly. But why would such a thing exist? Holmes gestured toward the flickering candlelight. Many old churches have hidden vaults, my dear Lord Bainbridge. Some were built to hide treasures during times of war, others to conceal secrets the church wished to forget. He gestured toward the entrance. Shall we? Lestrade groaned. Of course, should have known this would turn into an underground affair. Armed with lanterns, we descended carefully into the hidden chamber below St. Agnes. The air was thick with dust and a faint scent of damp stone. The passage walls were narrow, lined with aged brick, and the ground sloped slightly downward. Holmes led the way, his sharp gaze flickering from side to side, noting every crack, every disturbance in the dust-laden floor. I walked beside Bainbridge, whose discomfort was growing with every step. I can't believe this place was beneath us all these years, he murmured. Holmes' voice drifted from ahead. And yet, someone remembered. After several minutes of careful descent, the passage opened into a small chamber. Our lantern light flickered against worn wooden shelves, their surfaces covered in layers of undisturbed dust. Old parchments and books lay scattered about, their bindings decayed with age. But what caught my attention, what froze me where I stood, was the single wooden chair at the center of the chamber, and the skeletal remains that sat upon it. Lestrade inhaled sharply. Well, that's unexpected. Bainbridge's face turned pale. Dear Lord. Holmes stepped forward, his sharp gaze locking onto the skeletal figure. It sat eerily upright, its bony fingers still resting upon the armrests as though waiting for judgment. I swallowed. How long do you think he's been here? Holmes crouched beside the remains, carefully inspecting the decayed fabric still clinging to the bones. Judging by the state of decomposition and the fabric's design, he trailed off, then stood. At least 2 decades, perhaps longer. Lestrade rubbed his jaw. Who the hell locks a man away beneath a church? Holmes turned to Bainbridge. Tell me, does St. Agnes Cathedral keep records of past clergy members? Bainbridge, still staring at the remains, nodded weakly. Yes, archives going back centuries. Holmes exhaled. Tend, we shall need access to them, 'cause I suspect our unfortunate friend here was not buried by accident. Lestrade, regaining his composure, began inspecting the surrounding walls, running his fingers over the stonework. There's something else here. Holmes, looks like a carving. Holmes strode over as Lestrade stepped aside, revealing a name etched deeply into the wall just behind the chair. Beneath Agnes lies the sin. The words, though aged, sent a chill through all of us. Bainbridge took a step back. Tude, what does that mean? Holmes' expression darkened. It means that St. Agnes has been weeping, not for a miracle, but for a secret buried beneath her feet. I felt my stomach turn. And whoever sent those letters, they knew. Holmes nodded. Yes, Watson, and now, so do we. A heavy silence hung in the air of St. Agnes's Cathedral's hidden chamber, disturbed only by the flickering of our lanterns. The skeletal remains, seated as if awaiting judgment, cast eerie shadows along the damp stone walls. Above them, the carved inscription loomed. Beneath Agnes lies the sin. Lestrade ran a hand through his hair. I'll admit, Holmes, I've seen my fair share of bodies, but I've never found one tucked away beneath the church. Holmes remained still, his sharp eyes scanning every detail of the chamber, the placement of the bones, the dust-laden books, the structure of the walls. This was no mere burial, Lestrade. This man was hidden here. The real question is by whom? Lord Bainbridge, still pale from the discovery, cleared his throat. Mr. Holmes, I assure you, I had no knowledge of this. If the clergy knew of a body beneath the church, they never spoke of it. Holmes finally turned from the skeleton. That, Lord Bainbridge, I do not doubt, but someone perhaps long before your tenure went to great lengths to ensure this. Man was forgotten. I gestured toward the remains. Could we determine his identity? Some clue as to who he was? Holmes nodded. That is precisely our next course of action. He turned to Bainbridge. You mentioned that the cathedral keeps archival records. We shall need access to them immediately. Bainbridge hesitated, then nodded. I'll take you to them, Holmes. Smiled. Excellent. And while we search for our unfortunate guest's name, I suggest we send word to Scotland Yard. This body is a matter for the law now. Lestrade sighed. For once, Holmes, I don't disagree. The archives of St. Agnes were kept in a dusty, candlelit room deep within the cathedral. Lined with heavy wooden shelves, stacked with leather-bound tomes, the air was thick with the scent of aged parchment and wax, the silence punctuated only by the occasional creak of old wood beneath our footsteps. Bainbridge led us to an ancient wooden desk, pulling out a massive ledger bound in cracked leather. This contains the records of clergy and staff who served at St. Agnes for the past century, he explained. If your discovery was someone tied to the church, his name should be here. Holmes wasted no time, flipping through the pages with swift precision. His eyes scanned each entry, fingers tracing names and dates with practiced efficiency. Lestrade, ever impatient, leaned over his shoulder. What exactly are you looking for? Holmes did not glance up. Patterns, Inspector. Sudden disappearances. Unexplained resignations. Someone who was here, and then wasn't. I watched in fascination as Holmes' sharp gaze darted over the pages, absorbing details far too quickly for my own comprehension. Then he stopped. His fingers rested on a name. Father Jonathan Alden, deceased, 1871. Lestrade frowned, and Holmes' expression was unreadable. A man recorded as deceased, yet without any listed burial. I leaned in, examining the entry. Unlike the other deceased clergy, whose names were marked with locations of interment, Alden's record simply ended. No funeral, no transfer, no explanation. Holmes tapped the page. Tell me, Lord Bainbridge, was there ever a Father Alden? Bainbridge frowned. The name is familiar, but I do not recall any specific accounts of his death. If he had passed in service, he should be listed in the cathedral's memorial records. Holmes stood abruptly, closing the ledger. But then, we must find those records, 'cause I suspect Father Alden did not simply die. He was erased. The memorial plaques of St. Agnes were displayed along the east wing of the cathedral, engraved with the names of clergy who had served and passed within its sacred walls. Holmes, Bainbridge, Lestrade, and I moved silently beneath the towering arches, our lanterns casting long shadows across the stone, one by one. We examined the plaques, and sure enough, there was no mention of Father Jonathan Alden. Lestrade exhaled. So we've got a dead priest without a grave, a hidden skeleton beneath the church, and a statue that suddenly starts weeping. He scowled. Holmes, tell me this isn't leading to some bloody occult nonsense. Holmes smirked. Lestrade, I assure you, this is a very human deception. Bainbridge rubbed his chin. If Alden was removed from the records, it must have been deliberate. But why? What could he have done to warrant such an erasure? Holmes turned to me. Watson, you're a man of medicine. What can you tell from the remains we discovered? I considered. Given the state of decomposition, I'd estimate he's been there for at least 30 years, which aligns with Alden's recorded death in 1871. The bones were undisturbed, which suggests he was not simply buried and forgotten, he was sealed away, Lestrade muttered, like a secret no one wanted found. Holmes nodded. Precisely. Bainbridge exhaled. Who would do such a thing? Priest, buried like a criminal beneath the church. It's unthinkable. Holmes' voice was calm. Unthinkable, and yet it was done. He turned back toward the cathedral's main hall, which means there is only one thing left to determine. Lestrade frowned. And that is? Holmes smiled faintly. What sin Father Alden carried to his grave. As we made our way back toward the nave of the cathedral, the solemn air seemed heavier, charged with the weight of our discovery. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was watching, that whoever had sent the warning letters knew we were drawing closer. And then, Matthias, as we reached the main aisle Bainbridge, stopped abruptly. Good Lord, he breathed. We followed his gaze to the altar, where a fresh piece of parchment had been placed. It had not been there before. Holmes strode forward, lifting the note carefully. The handwriting was familiar, the same uneven script as the first warning. He read it aloud. The saint weeps for the forgotten, but you will not weep alone. Huh? Chill ran through me. Lestrade stiffened. Oh, that sounds like a bloody threat. Holmes studied the note, his fingers tracing the edges. No, Lestrade, that sounds like a warning of what's to come. Bainbridge's face had gone pale. You don't think? Holmes turned to him, his expression unreadable. I think, he said quietly, that whoever buried Alden did not act alone, and someone perhaps even now wants to ensure their secret remains buried. Lestrade clenched his fists. Then we'd best be quick about finding them. Holmes folded the note carefully, tucking it into his coat. Indeed, Inspector, for I fear this mystery is only just beginning. The words from the second note still lingered in the cold air of St. Agnes's Cathedral. The saint weeps for the forgotten, but she will not weep alone. Lestrade stood beside me, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the great nave as if expecting some shadowy figure to emerge from the darkened pews. Bainbridge, still pale from our discoveries, held his hands together as though in silent prayer. Holmes remained entirely still. The parchment with the ominous message was clutched between his fingers, but his gaze was fixed on something beyond it, something unseen. Then, at last, he spoke. The author of these messages is no mere observer, he murmured. They are guiding us. They wish for the truth to be found. Lestrade scoffed. Oh, come off it, Holmes. Whoever's behind this isn't trying to help us. They're trying to frighten the whole bloody city. Holmes' lips curled into a faint smile. And yet, what purpose does fear serve if the crime remains buried? No, Lestrade, this is not a game of terror. It is a reckoning. Bainbridge exhaled. A reckoning for whom? Holmes turned the note over in his hands before slipping it into his coat. That, my dear Lord Bainbridge, is what we must discover, and I believe our next step is clear. I glanced at him. The archives. Holmes shook his head. Oh, Watson, the living. We have spent enough time among the dead. This time we spoke to those who might remember. Despite the lateness of the hour, Holmes insisted that we waste no time in seeking out the oldest living member of the clergy who had served at St. Agnes. With Bainbridge's assistance, we were soon directed to Father Matthias Hale, a retired priest now residing at a modest vicarage on the outskirts of London. The night had grown colder, and a damp mist clung to the narrow streets as our carriage came to a stop before the small cottage. A faint light glowed from within, casting flickering shadows through the lace-curtained windows. Holmes knocked once, twice, after a long pause. The door creaked open, revealing a thin, elderly man, his face deeply lined, his white hair a wisped halo in the dim candlelight. His sharp eyes flickered over us, lingering on Bainbridge. "I have been expecting you," he said softly. Bainbridge hesitated. "You, how could you?" Father Hale stepped aside. "Come in, we have much to discuss." The vicarage was sparse, but warm, the scent of burning tallow mixing with aged parchment and a faint trace of incense. Hale gestured for us to sit at a worn wooden table, where a simple brass crucifix stood among scattered papers. Holmes wasted no time. "Father, you know why we are here?" Hale nodded, folding his hands before him. "You found him, then?" The room fell silent. I exhaled slowly. "Then you knew about Alden?" Hale's gaze dropped to his hands. "I knew of his fate, yes. I did not know where he was laid to rest, but when I heard of the letters, I feared the past was rising once more." Lestrade leaned forward. "Dan, let's stop speaking in riddles, Father. What happened to him?" Hale sighed, his voice heavy with old grief. "Father Jonathan Alden was a good man, a devout man, but he made an enemy of the wrong people." Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Go on." Hale's fingers tightened. "Alden discovered something, case secret, buried within the cathedral walls. He tried to expose it, to bring it to light, but before he could, he vanished." Bainbridge's voice was barely above a whisper, and the church said nothing. Hale exhaled. There was an official statement that he had been transferred to another diocese. But those of us who knew him, who served beside him, we knew the truth. Lestrade's expression darkened. That he had been silenced. Hale nodded. The church was not responsible, but someone with power ensured that Alden would never speak again. Holmes tapped his fingers against the wooden table. "And what exactly had he discovered?" Hall hesitated. Then, at last, he whispered, "Murder." The room felt suddenly colder. I leaned forward. "Murder? But whose?" Hale's voice dropped lower. "A child. A boy, no older than 8. He was found dead within the walls of the cathedral, itself hidden away, as though never meant to be found." He exhaled. "Alden discovered the body by accident during repairs to the old confessional chambers. He sought to uncover who was responsible, and that was his undoing." Bainbridge looked as if he might be ill. "Good Lord, a child." Lestrade's hand clenched into a fist. "And you're saying this was covered up?" Hale nodded. "I was young then, only newly ordained, but I remember the fear." The clergy whispered that someone among the higher ranks had sins to hide, and those sins had cost an innocent life. Holmes' expression remained unreadable, and Alden, being a man of integrity, sought justice. Hale's face was grim. "Yes, but he never lived to see it." A long silence followed. Then Holmes stood abruptly. "We must return to St. Agnes at once." I blinked. "So soon? What have you deduced?" Holmes turned toward us, his voice sharp, with purpose. "Watson, we now know the nature of the crime, but what we lack is the culprit. If Alden's records were erased, then so too was the name of the one responsible." He turned to Bainbridge. "You said the cathedral archives go back centuries, correct?" Bainbridge nodded. "Yes." Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Then we shall find our killer hidden between the lines." As we prepared to leave, Father Hale suddenly reached out, grasping Holmes' wrist. "Be careful, Mr. Holmes." Holmes paused, his gaze meeting the old priest's. Hale's voice was barely above a whisper. "The one who buried Alden may be long dead, but their legacy may yet live on. The past is rising, then someone still has reason to keep it buried." Holmes studied him for a moment, then gave a single nod. We stepped into the cold night, the mist curling around us like unseen fingers, and somewhere in the darkness, a secret was waiting to be uncovered. The mist followed us like a living thing as we made our way back to St. Agnes Cathedral, the echoes of Father Hale's revelation still heavy in the air. A child's murder, a buried priest, a secret that refused to die. Holmes sat deep in thought. During the carriage ride, his sharp features cast in shadow by the dim lantern light. Lestrade, meanwhile, drummed his fingers impatiently against the seat. "I don't like this, Holmes," he muttered. "Someone killed that priest to keep the past buried, and now we're tearing the whole thing open." Holmes exhaled, his gaze distant. "And so we must, Lestrade. Whoever went to such lengths to erase Alden did so for a reason. And now, 2 decades later, someone else wishes the truth to be known." I shifted uncomfortably. But why now? If Alden was silenced, if the child's death was hidden, why wait all these years to reveal it? Holmes's fingers tapped against his knee. "'Cause the past is rarely content to remain buried, Watson. Secrets are like wounds left untreated. They fester." Bainbridge, seated beside me, still looked shaken. "And you believe the answer lies in the cathedral archives?" Holmes turned to him, his eyes gleaming. "I believe that if we are to find the killer, we must first find the child. Upon arriving at St. Agnes, we've wasted no time in making our way back to the archives." Towering stone walls seemed to close in around us as Bainbridge retrieved the oldest of the cathedral's ledgers, setting them upon the heavy wooden table. The leather bindings were worn, the pages yellowed with time. Holmes wasted no time, flipping through the records with precision. The boy would have been discovered before Alden's disappearance, likely in the late 1860s or early 1870s. Bainbridge scanned the names along with us, tracing each entry with a careful finger. There were many baptisms, marriages, even deaths recorded in these years. But if what Father Hale said is true, if the boy's death was covered up, then it may not be here at all. Lestrade, ever practical, crossed his arms. "Then what exactly are we looking for?" Holmes did not glance up. "An absence, Inspector. A missing entry, a name erased, a break in an otherwise meticulous record." Minutes passed in silence as the pages turned. I could hear the faint creak of the cathedral settling, the dim candlelight flickering against the stone walls. And then Holmes stopped. His fingers rested on a page where the ink had faded unnaturally, as though someone had scrubbed at the parchment. The dates progressed normally, but there was an abrupt gap in the records where a name should have been. There was only an empty space, the faint ghost of erased letters lingering in the margins. Holmes exhaled slowly. "There, do you see it?" Bainbridge leaned in, his brow furrowing. "Good Lord, someone removed this entry." Lestrade frowned. "You can't erase a death, Holmes." Holmes smiled thinly. "No, Lestrade, but you can erase a name." Holmes studied the faint markings on the parchment with an intensity that made my own eyes ache. He lifted the page slightly, angling it toward the candlelight, then produced a small vial of chemical reagent from his coat. I sighed. "Holmes, must you always carry some mysterious concoction in your pockets?" Holmes did not look up. A well-prepared man, Watson, is rarely surprised. He dabbed a few drops of the solution onto the erased section of the parchment and slowly faint. Ghostly letters began to reappear. The ink had been nearly destroyed, but not completely. A set of initials emerged from the faded parchment. T.R. Lestrade frowned. T.R. That's not a name. Holmes smiled. No, Inspector, but it is the key to one. Bainbridge inhaled sharply. Wait, I remember something. He turned abruptly, moving toward an older shelf of records, pulling out a bound genealogy book of the cathedral's past benefactors. He flipped through the pages swiftly, then stopped, his expression one of growing horror. Lestrade leaned over. What is it? Bainbridge swallowed hard. T.R. Theodore Richardson. Holmes' expression darkened. And who was he? Bainbridge hesitated. One of the largest donors to St. Agnes in the mid-1800s, a wealthy businessman. His name appears on many of the old church renovations. Faltered. But I recall reading something his family was embroiled in scandal. There were rumors. Double quotes. Holmes took the book, scanning it quickly. Not rumors. Lord Bainbridge, a cover-up. Holmes turned the book to face us. There, among the records of notable patrons, was an entry for Theodore Richardson. It listed his generous donations to the church, his role in financing major renovations in the 1860s. And buried among the details, a brief mention of his only son, Edgar Richardson, deceased 1869. I inhaled sharply. The same year, Father Alden disappeared. Lestrade swore under his breath. So, Richardson's son was the one who Holmes snapped the book shut. Yes, Lestrade. Edgar Richardson was the child Alden found hidden within the cathedral walls, Bainbridge whispered, and his father had the power to erase his name. Holmes nodded. It is no coincidence that Theodore Richardson financed extensive renovations during those years. It is no coincidence that Alden, who discovered the boy, was silenced. Lestrade's expression hardened. That's it. Then Richardson killed his own son and buried him in the church. When Alden found out, he had him murdered. Holmes tapped his fingers against the table. Perhaps, but we still lack motive. Did Richardson kill his son, or was he protecting someone else? I frowned. What do you mean? Holmes turned to Bainbridge. Are there any surviving members of the Richardson family? Bainbridge hesitated. The family fell into ruin after Theodore's death. But there was one surviving heir, his younger brother, Arthur Richardson. He left London years ago, but I believe... He trailed off. Holmes' voice was sharp. Kaya's face paled. I believe he recently returned. A long silence followed. Then Holmes smiled, cold, sharp, and knowing. Well then, he murmured, I believe it is time we paid Mr. Richardson a visit. The carriage wheels rattled over the uneven streets as we made our way toward Arthur Richardson's residence. The night had deepened, and a thick fog curled through the alleyways, swallowing the gaslight glow in its misty embrace. Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. Beside me, Lestrade fidgeted impatiently, his frustration barely concealed. I'll admit, Holmes, he muttered, this is all starting to make sense, but it doesn't explain why now. If Richardson was the last of his family, why has someone suddenly decided to dig up an old crime? Holmes exhaled. 'Cause, Lestrade, the past has a way of demanding justice when it has been denied for too long. Bainbridge, still pale from our discoveries, leaned forward. But what do we expect to learn from Arthur Richardson? Holmes' gaze did not waver. Whether he is the orchestrator of this elaborate revelation, or merely another piece in a game we have yet to fully understand. Our carriage pulled up before a once grand townhouse, now standing in eerie disrepair. The shutters were closed, the stone facade stained by years of neglect. A house forgotten, much like its owner. Lestrade rapped sharply on the door. For a long moment, there was no answer. Then, just as we were considering forcing the issue, the latch clicked, and the door creaked open. A tall, gaunt man stood in the entryway. His hair was silvered, though his eyes remained keen, dark, and wary. Holmes inclined his head. "Mr. Arthur Richardson, I presume." The man's gaze flickered over us, lingering on Bainbridge before settling on Holmes. He exhaled slowly. "You've come about my brother." Lestrade stiffened. "Then you know why we're here?" Richardson gave a humorless chuckle. "Of course, you've uncovered the bones. And now you seek the hands that buried them." Holmes' eyes sharpened. "Key. Then let us not waste time, Mr. Richardson. Tell us the truth about Edgar." Key. Richardson led us into a dimly lit parlor, the air thick with dust and the scent of old paper. He gestured toward the worn furniture, but remained standing himself. "My nephew," he murmured, almost to himself, "dead for decades, and yet he still haunts us." Holmes remained impassive. "Your family went to great lengths to erase his death, Mr. Richardson. The question is why?" Richardson's lips pressed into a thin line. "'Cause my brother was a coward." The silence in the room deepened. I exchanged a glance with Lestrade, who crossed his arms. "A coward, you say?" Richardson exhaled. "Edgar Richardson was not murdered." Bainbridge let out a breath. "Then what happened to him?" Richardson turned toward the window, gazing into the fog. "Edgar was a sickly child, prone to fevers and fits. He was never strong. And one night, during a terrible storm, he vanished from his bed. They searched the house, the grounds only, to find him lifeless within the walls of St. Agnes." I felt a chill creep up my spine. "You mean he wandered there himself?" Richardson nodded. "The doors were never locked in those days. He must have slipped out, drawn by some childhood fancy. By the time they found him, it was too late." Holmes' voice remained steady. "And yet, instead of reporting his death, Theodore Richardson concealed it." Richardson's jaw tightened. "Yes, my brother, in his grief, in his shame, hid the truth. He had poured his fortune into St. Agnes, held great pride in its restoration, and now his own son had perished there, alone." Lestrade muttered. "So, rather than face scandal, he buried the truth." Richardson turned to us, his eyes hard. "Do you think the world is kind to men of power who falter?" My brother knew the weight of his position. A Richardson scandal would have destroyed him. Holmes studied him for a long moment. Father Alden. A flicker of guilt crossed Richardson's face. Alden was an honorable man, too honorable. When he discovered the boy's remains, he demanded justice. He threatened to expose what had been done. Lestrade's voice darkened. "Brother couldn't allow that." Richardson's silence was answer enough. I felt a wave of nausea, so he silenced him. Richardson exhaled. "Yes, but not through murder." Lestrade frowned. "Then what happened to Alden?" Richardson hesitated. "Theodore was not a violent man, but he was desperate. He paid men to frighten Alden, to force him into silence. But something went wrong." Holmes' voice was quiet. "They sealed him away beneath the church." Richardson's fingers tightened. "Yes." The weight of the confession pressed upon the room. I swallowed hard. "And what of you, Mr. Richardson? What part did you play?" For the first time, his composure cracked. "I was young," he whispered, "and I was afraid. I knew what had happened. But I remained silent." His voice shook. "I have lived with that silence for 20 years. A heavy silence followed. Then Lestrade's voice cut through. "And now someone has decided the world should know." Richardson inhaled. "Yes, but it is not me." Holmes tilted his head. "Then tell me, Mr. Richardson, who else remembers?" Richardson's eyes darkened. "There was one other." Holmes leaned forward. "Who?" Richardson's lips parted. But before he could speak, a sudden noise shattered the quiet. A gunshot. The window exploded. Shards of glass flying through the room. Lestrade pulled his revolver. "Put pushing Bainbridge down as the second shot rang out. Holmes moved with practiced speed, ducking behind a chair. "Get down." I barely had time to react before a third shot struck the mantelpiece, splintering wood and sending embers scattering across the rug. Outside, through the swirling fog, a shadow moved. Lestrade cursed. "We're not alone." Holmes' voice was sharp. "No, Watson. Someone does not want this truth to come to light." Another gunshot rang out, and then footsteps fading into the night. Holmes straightened, his expression unreadable. "Gentlemen," he murmured, brushing dust from his coat, "I believe we have just met our true enemy." The echo of the gunshots still reverberated in the dimly lit parlor of Arthur Richardson's townhouse. Shattered glass crunched beneath Lestrade's boots as he hurried to the window, his revolver raised, peering into the thick, curling fog that had swallowed the street beyond. "Blast it," he muttered. "They're gone." Ever composed, dusted off his coat and stepped toward the broken window. He did not look out immediately, instead kneeling to examine the jagged fragments strewn across the floor. His fingers lightly touched the impact point where the bullet had struck the mantelpiece. "A skilled marksman," he murmured. No wild shot, each was precise, intended to kill. I exhaled, my pulse still racing. Then they weren't simply trying to frighten us. Holmes glanced at me. "No, Watson. This was an execution attempt." Arthur Richardson, pale and visibly shaken, had pressed himself against the wall. His fingers trembled as he wiped sweat from his brow. "So, it's true," he muttered. "The past refuses to stay buried." Holmes turned to him. "Mr. Richardson, you said there was one other person who knew the truth about Edgar's death." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. "Tell me, before it is too late." Richardson swallowed hard. He opened his mouth, but before he could answer, a scrap of paper fluttered through the broken window. Carried by the night air, Lestrade moved quickly, retrieving it from the floor. He unfolded the crumpled note, his eyes narrowing as he read aloud. "Do not speak his name. The saint weeps, and soon so shall you." Bainbridge paled. "Good Lord." Holmes took the note from Lestrade, examining the paper. It's the same handwriting as the previous warnings. His voice was cool, detached, but now the message has changed. No longer a warning, a threat. Lestrade scowled. And a promise of more violence. Holmes turned back to Richardson. "The name, Mr. Richardson." Richardson hesitated. He glanced at the note, then at the broken window, as if expecting another bullet to come whistling through the mist. Then, at last, in a low, shaking voice, he whispered, "Thomas Redford." A silence fell over the room. I frowned. "And who is Thomas Redford?" Richardson let out a slow breath. "He was my brother's confidant, a close advisor, a powerful man. He helped my brother cover up Edgar's death, but after Theodore died, he vanished, left London entirely." Lestrade crossed his arms. "And now, you're telling me he's back?" Richardson exhaled. "I don't know. But if there is anyone left who still has a reason to keep this secret buried, it would be him." Holmes studied him for a long moment, then turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, you must put men on guard here. Whoever fired those shots may return to finish what they started." Lestrade nodded. "I'll have a watch set up outside." Holmes slipped the threatening note into his coat. "As for us, we must find Thomas Redford before he finds us." With Lestrade's men stationed outside Richardson's home, we departed for Scotland Yard, where Lestrade intended to search for any trace of Thomas Redford in official records. The fog had thickened, muffling the sounds of the city, lending the air an eerie quiet. Inside Lestrade's office, Holmes immediately set to work, combing through old files with the meticulous precision I had come to expect. Lestrade rifled through the police ledgers, shaking his head. Redford's name isn't coming up anywhere in recent records. If he returned to London, he didn't do it under his own name. Holmes, unfazed, turned to another section of documents property records. A man like Redford would not return without establishing a new foothold. If he is here, we shall find him through his investments. Minutes passed as Holmes examined the listings, then a flicker of movement in his expression. He tapped the page. Here. Lestrade and I leaned over his shoulder. T.R. Holdings, registered owner. Thomas Redford. Lestrade frowned. And what does T.R. Holdings own? Holmes' eyes darkened. A warehouse. In Southwark, I exhaled. In what business does a vanished man have in a forgotten warehouse? Holmes folded the paper carefully. That, Watson, is precisely what we must find out. By the time we arrived in Southwark, the city had settled into the late hours of the night. The warehouse, a large and looming structure, stood near the docks. Its old wooden beams weathered by time and the damp London air. A single lamp burned dimly outside the entrance. Holmes halted, his gaze sweeping over the building. This is not the residence of a man simply seeking refuge. It is a base of operations. Lestrade tightened his grip on his revolver. Then, let's find out who's inside. We moved cautiously. Holmes motioned for silence as he tried the door dash unlocked. We entered. The air was thick with dust and the scent of old wood. A long corridor led toward the interior, where faint candlelight flickered. Someone was inside. Holmes stepped lightly, his movements deliberate. Then he suddenly halted, raising a hand to signal us to stop. On the floor, barely visible against the wooden planks, a single line of fresh wax. Holmes crouched, inspecting it. A trigger line, he murmured. Connected to a snap. Holmes lunged back, dragging me with him as a trap was sprung. A heavy wooden beam crashed down from the ceiling, smashing into the floor where we had stood just moments before. Lestrade cursed. Damn it, Holmes, you could have warned me. Holmes dusted himself off. I believe I just did, Inspector. A voice echoed from deeper inside the warehouse. You're a persistent man, Mr. Holmes. I tensed. The voice was deep, cold, calculated. From the shadows, a figure stepped forward. A man in his 50s, his hair neatly combed, his dark eyes sharp and intelligent. He wore a fine, if slightly outdated, suit. A man of wealth, of control. Holmes straightened. Thomas Redford, I presume. Redford smiled faintly. You presume correctly. Lestrade took a step forward, revolver raised. You're coming with us. Redford did not flinch. Huh? He clasped his hands behind his back. Do you even know why you're here, Inspector? Holmes' voice was calm. To uncover the truth about Edgar Richardson. To bring justice to Father Alden. Redford's smirk deepened. Justice, he chuckled. You have no idea what you're meddling in. Holmes' eyes narrowed. Okay, then do enlighten us. Redford exhaled, shaking his head. You see, Mr. Holmes, you've mistaken a ghost story for a game of power. He took a slow step forward. I didn't return to London to hide the truth, he murmured. I returned to control it. Chill crept down my spine. Holmes tilted his head. And who else shares your ambition, Mr. Redford? Redford's smile did not fade, but his next words sent a shiver through the room. I believe you already know their name. A silence stretched through the dimly lit warehouse in Southwark, heavy as the mist curling outside its rotting beams. Thomas Redford stood before us. His expression measured, composed, a man who had anticipated this moment. Holmes, ever poised, studied him with those calculating eyes that had dismantled many a man's defenses. You say this is not a game of ghosts, Mr. Redford, but of power. His voice was steady. "Then let us dispense with the theatrics. What do you want?" Redford chuckled softly. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, you assume I am here to want something?" Lestrade scoffed, keeping his revolver level. "Men don't set traps and leave warnings unless they've got something to lose." Redford inclined his head, almost in amusement. "Perhaps," his dark eyes gleamed, "or perhaps I am merely ensuring that fools do not interfere in affairs beyond their understanding." Holmes folded his arms. "Affairs such as the murder of Father Jonathan Alden." A flicker of something annoyance, amusement, passed over Redford's face. "Alden," he murmured, "a righteous man who did not understand the world in which he lived." Holmes tilted his head. "And what world was that?" Redford exhaled. "The world where truth is not a virtue, but a weapon. A world where knowledge, carefully managed, is the difference between ruin and survival." Lestrade frowned. "Talk a lot for a man with a gun pointed at him." Redford smirked. "And yet, Inspector, you have not fired." A tense silence followed. Then Holmes spoke. "You controlled the narrative of Edgar Richardson's death, matured his father's. Secrets remained hidden. And now, all these years later, you have returned to reassert control." Redford regarded him carefully. "You see much, Mr. Holmes, but do you see enough?" Holmes remained still. "I see a man who stands at the center of this affair, and yet not at the top." Redford's smirk did not waver. "But I noticed, just briefly, a shift in his posture." Holmes pressed on. "Who else has a hand in this, Redford?" The older man remained silent. Lestrade, however, stepped forward, lowering his voice. "Who sent you back to London?" For the first time, Redford's expression truly darkened. "Do not ask questions," he murmured, "for which you do not want the answers." Holmes smiled thinly. "Ah, so there is another." Redford's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Holmes turned slightly, his gaze flickering toward the ledgers and documents stacked upon a wooden table nearby. Without hesitation, he strode toward them, flipping open a thick, well-worn volume. Redford tensed. "I wouldn't do that, Mr. Holmes." Holmes ignored him, running his fingers across the names and figures scrawled in the old ink. He stopped, abruptly, his brow lifting, and then his lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. Well, well," he murmured. "How very interesting." Lestrade and I stepped closer. Holmes turned the book so we could see. Among the records of property acquisitions and financial transactions, a single name appeared, circled in deep black ink. G.W. I frowned. "What does that mean?" Exhaled, closing the book with deliberate care. He turned back to Redford, his expression unreadable. "George Willoughby." A muscle twitched in Redford's jaw. Lestrade blinked. "Who?" Holmes did not break his gaze from Redford. "A former member of Parliament, once a respected figure in London's elite." His voice darkened. "The man who was closest to Theodore Richardson." Bainbridge, who had remained silent until now, let out a sharp breath. "Good Lord, I remember him. Willoughby vanished years ago, after his name became entangled in unsavory dealings." Holmes nodded. "And yet, it seems he never truly left." He gestured toward the ledger. "His name appears here, tied to recent financial movements, which means, gentlemen," he turned to us, "the architect of this deception may yet be alive." Lestrade muttered a curse. "You mean to say the man who covered up Edgar's death, who protected Richardson, who likely orchestrated Alden's fate, he's still out there?" Holmes' voice was cold. "Okay. And more than that, Lestrade, he's still pulling the strings." "For," another word could be spoken a sharp creak. Holmes turned his head a fraction of a second too late. From the shadows a flash of movement. A figure lunged, striking at Holmes with a blackjack, aiming for his skull. Holmes ducked. A blow glanced off his shoulder. He twisted, catching the attacker's wrist. A second figure moved from the left. Lestrade shouted. I barely had time to react before strong hands seized me, shoving me back against the wooden crates. Redford stepped backward into the shadows, untouched, unhurried. "Stop them," Lestrade barked, wrestling with a third attacker. Holmes spun, his assailant using the man's own momentum to send him crashing into a stack of barrels. There, trying to cover their tracks. I caught a brief glimpse of Redford moving toward the rear exit. "Holmes," I gasped, breaking free of my attacker. Holmes pivoted. But, too late. Redford disappeared into the foggy night, his coat a fleeting blur against the mist. Lestrade cursed, striking his attacker across the jaw. The man crumpled. The warehouse fell into silence, save for the heavy breathing of those still standing. Holmes exhaled sharply, straightening his coat. Well, he dusted off his sleeves. That was invigorating. Lestrade gave him a withering look. Invigorating. The bastard got away. Holmes adjusted his cuffs. "Yes, Inspector, but not without leaving something behind." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Holmes gestured to the open ledger, its pages still fluttering from where he had left it. "He led us to Willoughby." And now his voice was low. "Now we have a name to chase." Lestrade sighed. "And where do we find this Willoughby?" Holmes' smile was wicked. "Oh, I suspect he will find us first." The air in Scotland Yard was thick with the scent of damp wool and pipe smoke as we gathered in Lestrade's office, the weight of our discoveries pressing upon us. The open ledger from Redford's warehouse lay before us, the inked name, George Willoughby, circled in stark black strokes. Lestrade leaned against his desk, rubbing his temple. "So, we've uncovered the real architect of this mess. The man who covered up Edgar Richardson's death, who sought to father Alden's silence, and who likely sent Redford back to London to clean up any remaining traces." Holmes, seated comfortably in a chair, exhaled a slow stream of pipe smoke. "Precisely, Lestrade. And now, we must consider the question of why." I frowned. "It seems obvious, does it not? Willoughby was a powerful man. He buried a crime to protect his friends and himself." Holmes tapped his fingers against his knee. "Ah, Watson, you see the pieces, but not yet the pattern. Willoughby was indeed complicit in the initial cover-up, but consider the timing of these events." Lestrade arched an eyebrow. Why someone is dragging all of this back into the light after 20 years. Holmes nodded. "Exactly." His eyes gleamed. "We must ask ourselves who benefits from this reckoning." A heavy silence followed. Then Bainbridge, who had been sitting in thoughtful silence, spoke. "There is only one answer to that, Mr. Holmes." His voice was quiet but firm. "Someone who was wronged. Someone who still seeks justice." I felt a chill creep up my spine. "Then, you mean to say," Holmes smiled faintly, "Yes, Watson, I believe the author of the warnings is someone who has spent years waiting for this moment." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "And they are not finished yet." Lestrade had his men scour every available record for any mention of George Willoughby, but it quickly became apparent that he had lived in self-imposed exile for the last 15 years. There were no recent addresses, no business dealings under his own name. The man had seemingly vanished, until now. Lestrade slammed down a file onto his desk. "Well, would you look at this?" Holmes leaned forward, intrigued. Lestrade flipped the folder open. He checked property transfers under aliases and found something interesting. 2 months ago, a townhouse in Kensington was purchased under the name Gerald Warren. Bainbridge frowned. "And this is significant because—" Holmes smirked. "Because Gerald Warren conveniently shares the initials G.W. Lestrade nodded. And, more than that, the solicitor who arranged the transaction was the same man who used to handle Willoughby's legal affairs." Holmes tapped the desk. "Then we have found our man." I exhaled. "And what do we do now?" Holmes stood. "Simple, Watson. we pay him a visit. The Kensington townhouse stood at the end of a quiet, tree-lined street. The house was modest, unassuming, a perfect place for a man to disappear. Lestrade motioned for his men to position themselves nearby, then stepped forward and knocked sharply on the door. Silence. Holmes frowned. He reached into his coat, retrieving his magnifying glass, and studied the doorframe closely. "Interesting," he murmured. Lestrade sighed. "What is?" Holmes stepped back. "The lock was forced recently. Someone else has been here before us." Lestrade's expression darkened. "That's never a good sign." He tried the door. Swung open with a soft creak. Holmes entered first, his eyes sweeping over the interior. The air was stale, as if the house had been left untouched for days. Papers lay scattered across a desk in the front room, a fireplace filled with the remains of burned documents. And then we saw him, George Willoughby, or rather what was left of him. He was seated in a chair, his body slumped forward, his head resting against his chest. His hands lay limp on his lap, his coat still buttoned neatly. A glass of brandy sat untouched on the table beside him. I stepped forward, instinctively checking his pulse, but I already knew the answer. "He's dead," Lestrade swore under his breath. Holmes studied the scene with keen interest. No signs of a struggle, no obvious wounds, and yet he bent closer, sniffing the rim of the brandy glass. Bitter almonds. Lestrade's face twisted in understanding. "Cyanide." Holmes nodded. "A gentleman's murder. Quick, efficient, and most importantly ensuring that Willoughby will never speak." Bainbridge exhaled. Then we were too late. Holmes' lips pressed into a thin line. Tease. Or perhaps this was meant to be his final silence. Lestrade frowned. "You think someone forced him to drink it?" Holmes studied Willoughby's limp hands. A man like Willoughby would not simply accept his fate if he took the poison himself. It was only because someone gave him no alternative. I swallowed. "Then that means someone else is still out there." Holmes straightened. "Not just someone, Watson. The one who orchestrated this entire affair." As we turned to leave, something caught my eye, a scrap of paper resting on the desk among the scattered documents. I reached for it, unfolding it. Carefully, Thomas took it from my hands and read it aloud. "The saint has wept. The sinner is judged. But the final debt remains unpaid." Lestrade muttered a curse. Another message. Bainbridge inhaled sharply. "Then it's not over." Holmes stared at the note, deep in thought. "No, Lord Bainbridge, it is not." His fingers tightened around the paper. "We have uncovered the past, but someone who has been watching from the beginning is still moving the pieces." He turned to Lestrade. "We need to find Thomas Redford. Now." Lestrade blinked. "What?" "But he ran." Holmes cut him off. "And he ran because he knew something we did not." He exhaled. "Okay. And if we do not find him first, I suspect he will never be found again." A cold realization settled over the room. The case was nearing its end, but the final hand had yet to be played. The bells of St. Agnes Cathedral tolled in the distance as the last chapter of our mystery unfolded. The fog had thickened over London's winding streets, curling like a silent witness around Baker Street, where Holmes and I sat before a dying fire. The remnants of our case scattered across the table before us. George Willoughby was dead. Thomas Redford had vanished, and the final message, the one found beside Willoughby's lifeless body, still lingered in my mind. The saint has wept. The sinner is judged, but the final debt remains unpaid. Even with the mastermind unmasked, one question remained. Who had delivered the final blow? Holmes sat deep in thought, his long fingers pressed together beneath his chin. He had said little since we had left Scotland Yard, and I knew better than to disturb him. He was waiting, watching the pieces of the puzzle shift within his mind. Then At last, he spoke. "Watson," he murmured, "tell me, what do you make of this case?" I frowned, considering a cover-up that lasted 2 decades, a child's death hidden by powerful men, a priest who sought justice and paid the ultimate price, and, finally, a reckoning delivered by an unseen hand. Holmes nodded. "Precisely. But let me ask you this. Who, in the end, truly administered justice?" I hesitated. "Redford." Holmes shook his head. "No, Watson. Redford was a pawn, a piece moved across the board at another's command. Willoughby's death, his judgment, came from someone else." I exhaled. "Then who?" Holmes turned his gaze toward the fire. "We must revisit the first clue ever given to us. The first warning. The saint weeps for the forgotten." His voice was quiet. "Who, Watson, was truly forgotten?" I felt my breath catch. "You mean?" Holmes nodded. "Yes, Watson. Edgar Richardson." A heavy silence settled between us. I swallowed hard. "But Edgar is dead, Holmes. He has been dead for over 20 years. Holmes exhaled. "Indeed, but the dead are rarely without witnesses." The next morning, we returned to St. Agnes Cathedral, where Lord Bainbridge was already waiting for us. Lestrade arrived moments later, his expression unreadable. "Well?" he asked. "You figured it out." Holmes nodded. "Inspector, and if I am correct, we shall find our final answer where this case began." We entered the cathedral, the vast stone walls towering above us. The statue of St. Agnes still stood solemnly at the altar, its marble face streaked with the dried remnants of its mysterious tears. Holmes stepped forward, his gaze sweeping the church. Then, softly, he called out, "You may come out now." A long silence followed. For a moment, nothing stirred. Then from the shadows of the confessional, a figure stepped forward, an old woman. She was frail, her face lined with age, her eyes sharp with something unspoken. A former nun, judging by the worn habit she still clutched around her thin frame. Bainbridge inhaled sharply. "Sister Mary." Lestrade frowned. "Who is she?" Bainbridge swallowed. She was a young novice when Father Alden disappeared. She left the order some years ago. I had no idea she was still in London." Holmes regarded her carefully. "And yet, she never truly left, did she?" The woman stared at Holmes, her hands trembling. "You are him," she whispered, "the one who sees." Holmes inclined his head. "And you, Sister Mary, are the one who remembers." She inhaled sharply. It had to be done. Lestrade's expression darkened. "Ha, ha. What had to be done?" Her voice was steady. "Justice." A chill ran through me. "You killed Willoughby." She said nothing. Holmes, however, gave a slow nod. "Not out of revenge, not out of hatred, but because, at last, someone had to pay the final price." Sister Mary closed her eyes. "He was the last of them, the last of the men who buried the truth. I was there, you see. I saw Edgar's lifeless body hidden away like an unwanted thing. I watched as Father Alden tried to bring the truth to light, only to be silenced himself." Her voice trembled. "And I said nothing. I was a coward. I let fear keep me silent." She exhaled shakily. "But when the letters began, when I saw that someone else sought the truth, I knew it was time to finish it." Holmes regarded her solemnly. "And so, you did." Lestrade stepped forward. "You'll have to come with me, sister." She smiled faintly. "I knew you'd say that." She lifted her hands, already prepared for the shackles. "I do not fear judgment. I only regret that it took me so long." Lestrade hesitated, then gestured for his men to escort her away. Holmes watched in silence as she disappeared into the mist outside. And just like that, the final piece of the mystery was laid to rest. Later that evening, Holmes and I returned to Baker Street, the weight of the case still heavy in my mind, as I poured us both a brandy. I turned to him. This was not like our usual cases, Holmes. He accepted his glass. No, Watson, it was not. I sat beside him. The murderer was not a monster. There was no grand villain, no dramatic confession. Just a woman who had waited too long to act. Holmes swirled his drink. Not every crime is born of greed or ambition, Watson. Some are simply the settling of old debts. I exhaled. And what of the weeping statue? Holmes chuckled. A simple trick, Watson. Hidden pipe, stalled within the marble base, likely put in place decades ago as part of some now forgotten church renovation. At some point, it leaked, allowing water to seep onto the saint's face, creating the illusion of tears. I smiled faintly, and yet, that illusion was enough to unravel an entire buried crime. Holmes leaned back, gazing into the fire. The world, my dear Watson, is full of illusions. Some we see for what they are. Others lead us to the truth. He closed his eyes, but in the end, the truth always prevails. A long silence stretched between us. Then Holmes finished his drink and stood. And now, Watson, I believe I hear Mrs. Hudson preparing supper. Let us attend to matters of greater importance. Kai, shaking my head. You never cease to amaze me, Holmes. He smirked. That, Watson, is entirely by design. We left the sitting room. I glanced back at the papers still strewn across the table. The case was closed, but somewhere beneath the quiet hum of London streets, forgotten saint still wept, and perhaps, at last, justice had wept with her.